All right, we will go ahead and introduce our speakers. I think we've got most people in at this point. Today, we are pleased to welcome Alexandra Cade. Alexandra serves as the Senior Curator and Director of Woodwind Studies at the Sigal Music Museum in Greenville, South Carolina, and is a scholar of the material culture of music, education, and performance in early 19th century America. A native of Philadelphia, Cade received her MA from the University of Delaware's Winterthur program in American material culture, where she studied historic soundscapes and the intersections between amateurism and craftsmanship in 19th century American square pianos. In addition to her time at Winterthur, Cade worked as the apprentice harpsichord maker at Colonial Williamsburg and has completed research fellowships at the Canterbury Shaker Village and the Museum of Early Southern Decorative Arts Summer Institute. She also holds undergraduate degrees in viola performance and history from the Eastman School of Music and the University of Rochester. Joining Alexandra Cade is Thomas Strange. Thomas Strange is the Executive Director and Chief Curator at the Sigal Music Museum. An accomplished builder and restorer of keyboard instruments, Strange has presented lectures, concerts, and papers on early piano development throughout the United States and Europe. In 2016, Strange and a small group of partners founded the Carolina Music Museum, which became the Sigal Music Museum in 2019, following a major gift from the Marlowe Sigal estate. In addition to his work with early keyboard instruments, he has an extensive background in materials science and is the author of 53 patents and numerous papers over the last 3 decades covering all aspects of medical device component development. Mr. Strange holds undergraduate and graduate degrees in physics from the University of South Carolina. Welcome to both of our presenters. At this point, I will go ahead and turn it over to Thomas and Allie.
Oh, thank you, Candace.
Hello and welcome.
Hello.
Hi. Oh, we're going to share our screen now. All right, ready to go. Well, thank you, Candace, and for the introduction, and thank you to the Polk Museum for having us today. We are thrilled to be here to talk about Sarah Polk and some of the musical traditions finding a footing in early 19th century Tennessee. The topics that we'll talk about today are really only a sliver of the rich musical cultures that were present throughout Middle Tennessee region, which also included traditions of the enslaved and free Black communities that found themselves moving westward, both by choice and by force, and of the Cherokee and Shawnee communities. Today, we can trace the fusion of many of these practices that were coming together to create new musical customs that were distinctly American. You walk into any number of historic house museums across America and you see a familiar scene, a keyboard instrument tucked into the corner of a parlor. The instrument may sit quietly now, but at one point it served as the center of a family's musical life. In a time where you weren't going to hear music unless you could make it yourself, the piano helped shape soundscapes of white upper middle class American homes. And for the young women who were often expected to learn and play these instruments, it could become a tool of agency, power, and control. When we talk about instruments from the past, it's important to remember that they went hand in hand with a player, creating an intimate, symbiotic relationship. People fostered highly personal relationships with their musical instruments, and for many, it was truly an extension of their sense of self. The piano is a wonderful vehicle to tell the story of the movement of people, places, and things into the American interior. The instrument of Sarah Childress Polk traces a similar path, following her from childhood, young adulthood, and on to new generations. And today, it survives as a testament to Sarah's life and legacy. Using the square piano as a jumping off point, we'll discuss Sarah Polk's musical life and education, including the music she played, especially as a younger woman. I'm also joined by my colleague, Tom Strange, who will talk about the westward movement of pianos and piano making. Now sitting proudly in the Polk House parlor, Sarah Childress Polk's piano was purchased by her father, Joel Childress, for Sarah and her elder sister Susan in their opulent family home on the Stones River outside of Murfreesboro, sometime while they were in school between 1816 and Joel's death in 1819. With Susan marrying a few years before Sarah, the piano likely stayed at the Stones River home until Sarah's 1824 marriage to James Polk, but likely longer, passing through the line of Sarah's younger brother, John, who didn't marry until 1831. It remained in the ownership of female descendants in John Childress's line until it came to the Polk House Museum in 1959. The instrument, a square piano, was made in London by the firm Astor and Horwood. It has a compass of FF to C4, which is just over 5.5 octaves, and that's around 2 octaves shorter than an 88-key modern instrument, which has just over 7 octaves. The Polk's Astor and Horwood also has a single damper pedal, which when engaged removes the damper from the strings, giving the instrument more sympathetic resonance and for an engaging and powerful effect. Brother of the well-known fur trader John Jacob Astor, the company began under craftsman George Astor in 1794, who moved from Germany to London as a woodwind maker, actually, producing flutes, bassoons, clarinets, and more. The firm quickly expanded into piano production and also published sheet music and collections of country dances. After being joined by partners in the first decade of the 19th century and producing instruments under the label George Astor & Co., George Astor died in 1813. The shop came under control of George Horwood, and the instruments going forward were labeled as Astor and Horwood. So the name board of the Polk piano represents the latter portion of the shop's workmanship. But how did this fine piano from London find its way to Middle Tennessee in the second decade of the 19th century? After crossing the ocean and arriving in a port city, Philadelphia, New York, Baltimore, or even Charleston, the Astor and Horwood piano made a long journey from the coast, hundreds of miles inland, traversing through the valleys and mountains of Appalachia before finally arriving in Nashville or Murfreesboro. Shortly after the arrival of this instrument, steamboat movement beginning in 1819 opened the door to further connections from ports like New Orleans or Pittsburgh. Increasing trade and an influx of people resulted in both Murfreesboro and Nashville to rapidly expand during the first few decades of the 19th century. Growing wealth from the annexation of native lands and the labor of enslaved individuals, more and more coastal residents began to move west to try to capitalize on this system that seemed to be so fruitful for so many. The steadily growing population with leisure time to spare attracted amusements of various types, from pop-up museum exhibitions to traveling acting troupes to pleasure gardens and concerts. For the white residents born and raised in the American interior, access to these amusements and entertainments served as an expansion of their worlds. Attending these concerts exposed residents to new works of music, new sounds, and new artists, potentially setting off local chain reactions in music education and the availability of sheet music. Additionally, women performers like Margaret Nightel, an itinerant clarinet player from Switzerland, who moved throughout the US in the second and third decades of the 19th century, complicated the gender roles of music as both a female professional and as a woman performing upon the clarinet, an instrument more traditionally associated with male musicians. As access to concerts and performing musicians grew, so did access to the instruments themselves. Nashville merchant John Decker was one of the earliest merchants of piano in the city, also operating a soda fountain and confectionery in the same shop. A few years later, he opened a Nashville version of a pleasure garden called Vauxhall, like its British counterpart. But he continued to advertise the sale of his instrument. And if I'm being honest, it is the first time I have seen a soda fountain and piano store merge together. Nashville papers began to be dotted with ads for pianos, with merchants sometimes becoming more specific regarding type. Like Steinway today, a name that nearly everyone knows and can associate with the piano, merchants would announce that they had Clementes and Astors and Albrechts for discerning customers to purchase. So I'll make sure to mention their superbly elegant construction and exquisite tone for an increasingly sophisticated populace. But Mr. Childress was eager to source the finest instrument for his family, and with his daughters in school in Nashville, it's possible he purchased the piano there rather than in Murfreesboro. And although this ad here is announced at least a decade after Mr. Childress's purchase, John Decker and his partner, Isham Dyer, announced that they were selling pianos by Astor & Co. in 1828. The square piano was the perfect instrument for domestic music making, an ideal fit for entertainment in the Tennessee parlor. While Mr. Childress acquired this instrument all the way from London, the breadth of piano craftsmanship was rapidly changing throughout the United States in the 1820s and 1830s. Not only were pianos being made in prolific quantities across America, they also no longer had to be exclusively imported from coastal cities or Europe. Artisans were picking up and the trade was moving west, eager to find their places in the zeitgeist of expansion.
All right, thank you, Ali. So what I wanted to do is take a little conversation through the introduction of the pianos into the early Western states. And it won't surprise anyone to know that pianos followed the populations as they would rise in the various parts of the early America. What is surprising is how quickly piano manufacturing would follow beyond. So if we go into it, we find, in very early notices in the papers, here's one for John Berendt of 1775. They were primarily for square pianos, although there's evidence for at least one grand piano being made at the time. And then Philadelphia and New York City were early cradles of piano making, followed shortly by Boston and Baltimore. So the early pianos are coming out of the major population centers, but the population is beginning its big shift to the west, starting in the early 1800s with the move into Ohio. And in his travel journals, John Mellish had written, of Cincinnati, that the people are becoming wealthy and polished in their manners, and that probably a manufactory of piano fortes would be possible on a small scale. It won't surprise anyone that in Cincinnati we see some of the very first piano making starting to take place. The builder, George Childress, left New York City, where he had been partnered with Archibald Waits to build pianos in Cincinnati in 1819, actually becoming one of the very first builders in that western state. In Lexington, Kentucky, we would see that Thomas Loud would move to Lexington and begin building somewhere in 1817 to 1819, and then followed shortly by William Thompson, who was very successful in Lexington. At least one of his pianos has survived, and possibly more. And he was building from 1824 to at least 1840 with pianos that were judged to be excellent for their time. One of the things that folks found was that in terms of making money, building pianos, selling pianos, and simply being a merchant often came together, and being the merchant was the more efficient way to go. And so we see a number of builders who start off making instruments transitioning into simply being store owners. As we mentioned, Thomas Loud had come into Philadelphia from London. He travels to Lexington in 1816 and starts the Western Piano Manufacturing Company. It's not clear that he met with much success there, but I think part of the problem was that Thomas Loud was as much a preacher as he was a piano maker. And later in his life, his service to God sort of outweighed his service to the piano manufacturing. But there he was at a very early time. So it tells us that, that Lexington, Kentucky, that Cincinnati, Ohio, were certainly becoming large enough to accommodate something as ephemeral as a piano builder. And you can sort of see in this map of the early Americas, the far west is, defined by, Mississippi, Tennessee, Kentucky, Indiana, Illinois, with the Missouri territories and the Arkansas territories off to the other Mississippi River. Mississippi was a huge way of bringing goods up through New Orleans and up into America. But until America had control of the Louisiana territories, that was an area that was sort of shut off from us. So the wagon road and western trails from Baltimore in particular into the west were common ways to move pianos and such goods into the western states. Occasionally we'll have a piano turn up that isn't actually what it says it is. So one of the cases is this piano by John Goodwin, and excuse me, it was misspelled the second time, but it's a John Goodwin piano at Liberty Hall in Frankfort, Kentucky. The label seems to indicate that it was built in 1801, but we know that in fact it's an Adam and William Guide piano from New York that has for some reason been relabeled. They kept all of the piano, including the original Guide label, but Goodwin's name has been pasted on top. So that throws a little bit of a monkey wrench into the researcher who's trying to figure out exactly what he's looking at. Among the earliest surviving pianos from a maker in the early Western state is Steele and Clark. Here's a wonderful example that you see in the picture on the right. Very German in the approach to the building, and it has a lot of elements about it that look like the CFL Albright piano that we also have in the collection, indicating that I think that Isaac Clark was the one who was the practical piano maker of the two. And I think he was bringing in some traditions that he had learned on his way from New Jersey into Cincinnati. Isaac Clark and Steele built from 1828 to 1830 when Steele died. Clark remained active and actually brought out a patent later in the 1830s, in 1836. So Elephant Steele died, leaving the area open. Andrew Rouse entered this opening coming from Vienna with a very strong Viennese piano background. And remember that in Cincinnati, the population is largely German at this time. And so he's building a piano that would be very, very welcome in German homes. This piano looks much like the Viennese pianos that are being built at the time, including the 4 pedals that you see down there that have the bassoon stop and the drum and bell, the janissary stops, along with the normal pedals for a mute that would come in and moderate the sound, and the dampers that would lift to give the sound full resonance. And he's building these pianos happily recorded by the government at the time at $500 each. So Nashville, Tennessee was a rapidly growing city in the 1830s, and in 1840, as the Great Depression begins to make piano sales difficult across the country, Otto Tork looked into putting a piano manufacturing factory in Nashville, similar to his operation in New York, and to supply the entire western half of America was his obvious intent. His plans came to a sudden stop when Torp and his family died in the wreck of the steamboat Erie in 1841. And we just have to include a little slide from that because it was a very dramatic moment. The wreck of the Erie appeared in papers all over the country. And among those lost was Otto Tork, his wife, and their 3 children, all of whom were below decks at approximately 8:10 p.m. in the evening when the fire broke out. And the whole event lasted probably less than 12 minutes. The thing was just a powder keg waiting to go. The painters were on board to paint the next steamship that was down the line. And so, everything was lined up to cause a complete disaster. And one of the neat parts was that after this, a lot of safety precautions were put in that had never been used on steamboats before. So during the 1840s, a poor economy put many piano makers out of business. In New York, fully 1/3 of all the piano makers that were in business in 1835 were gone by 1843. When piano making returned in 1845, the availability of rail and steamboat travel had expanded eastern markets into the West, and pianos from Boston and New York were constantly available, and coming up from New Orleans and the Mississippi, including Chickering and Nuns and Clark, particularly Nuns, Clark and Company in the 1830s, and then Nuns and Clark after 1839 had built most of their business on selling into the South and into the Western states. So the war between the states from 1861 to 65 had brought the piano commerce from the East to a near standstill. Traditional makers who sold into the South and the West from New York were out of business by the end of the war, including Nuns and Clark. Later, just simply Robert Nuns by himself. And that economic dislocation after the war and a series of depressions essentially discouraged piano manufacturing in the Midwest in particular between 1870 and 1885. But then after 1885, piano building really exploded in the larger cities, particularly in Detroit and Chicago and up and down the rivers. So examples are, the Baldwin and Wurlitzer in Cincinnati, Cable Nelson and Goldbrayson in Chicago, Jesse French and Sons in St. Louis, Grinnell Brothers in Detroit. And by 1810, the Midwest accounted for a third of all the pianos that were made in America.
So returning to Sarah and her musical life, we can begin to explore. How did Sarah become a musician? Where did she learn? And what did she play? Generally, most wealthy white women were steered towards a few particular instruments: the pedal harp, the guitar, and the piano. The flageolet, a wind instrument with a sound similar to a flute, was acceptable as well. However, the piano was by far the most popular. What local options for music education did a young wealthy white woman have in Middle Tennessee? Paralleling the growth of entertainments in the region, musicians and instructors began to come to town, offering to teach any range of instruments, but nearly always including the piano and the violin. Some also offered to make repairs and tune instruments when needed. Many of these names appear in newspapers across America. John Veltner and his relative Christian moved between Virginia, North Carolina, Kentucky, Maryland, and Tennessee, teaching music and repairing instruments. Miniaturist and music teacher Theodore Petikolas followed the same line of work as his celebrated Limner father, Philippe Abraham Petikolas, and moved throughout Pennsylvania, Alabama, Tennessee, and Ohio. And then John Mascarelli, advertising as a professor of music and composer, came from Italy and worked throughout the American backcountry, spending time in North Carolina, Ohio, Virginia, and Tennessee. These itinerant workers also came and went, so white parents looking for a more well-rounded and stable education could have their daughters attend one of the many academies that began to pop up in Middle Tennessee and across the South. Piano was often built into their curriculums, though it typically had an extra cost per semester. Not all academies had access to a piano right away. Not all academies had access to a piano right away, and when a school was able to obtain one for instruction, it was an exciting development. When the Nashville Female Academy secured a piano in 1820, it was even announced in the newspaper, showcasing the school's ability to stay competitive with a growing variety of ornamental academies. Some piano merchants cut a deal with these seminaries, knowing that an instrument at an educational institution surrounded by many wealthy girls could only improve their business. There are many fabulous studies on this topic, but white women's education in the early 19th century was undergoing rapid changes and reforms, with traditionalists pushing for the continuation of finishing schools teaching accomplishments like needlework and music, while more radical reformers like Emma Willard sought for women's education to be on par with that of men. Ultimately, there was value in both camps, giving young women different types of agency in their adult lives. Yet music, and more specifically the piano, remained a part of education in even the more equitable approach. So where does Sarah Polk's musical journey begin? After preliminary learning at a boys' school in Murfreesboro, she began to attend the Abercrombie boarding school around 1816 at the age of 13. Founded by Mr. and Mrs. John J. Abercrombie in 1814, the school started on site at a local plantation, but moved to downtown Nashville by the beginning of 1816. The couple split the subjects, which included geography and English grammar and varying needlework and painting, making this a more conservative ornamental school focusing on those accomplishments. However, we know that Mr. Abercrombie was the instructor for the music, advertising his instruction on the piano, guitar, flageolet, violin, and flute in 1818. At Abercrombie School, Sarah perhaps played the piano for the first time. She was likely introduced to the typical array of popular parlor songs being published for the piano, fairly simplistic melodic lines that were often arrangements of European opera arias, Scottish folk tunes, with love and loss as common subject matters. In-person instruction could also be supplemented by one of the many pedagogical books that were being published in both England and America. With her family building wealth through enslaved labor and the government's annexation of land from local indigenous communities, the Childresses enjoyed an opulent lifestyle surrounded by the finest things money could buy. Sarah lived an incredibly privileged life, but was actually even more privileged in her educational opportunities than other wealthy white women in Tennessee, as outlined by Amy Greenberg in her book Ladies First. Perhaps Sarah would have tried one of the other instruments that Mr. Abercrombie had professed to teach, the guitar or flageolet, but she left the school in 1817. Instead, she continued her education at one of the best schools for women in the early 19th century American South, the female boarding school in the Moravian community of Salem, North Carolina. You'll hear much more about the Academy in a few weeks with the lecture of Johanna Brown, curator at Old Salem, but the female boarding school was unlike most others at the time, as Moravians believed in an education for women more equal to men, giving Sarah the opportunity to engage with advanced texts and become more proficient in more traditionally masculine subjects like science and math. However, the Moravians were an incredibly musical community, possessing some of the earliest musical ensembles and producing some of the earliest musical instruments made in America. In 1818, while Sarah was a student there, a report on the school was compiled by Brother Abraham Gottlieb Steiner for the Synod in Herrnhut, Germany. Besides being an outstanding peek into early pedagogy overall, he mentions the role of music at the Academy, writing, "Among the various disciplines of knowledge, pupils receive instruction in music on the piano, singing, drawing, painting, common sewing techniques, embroidery, and timbre work." Steiner also emphasizes the practice of non-Moravian students purchasing Moravian choral books, spreading the Moravian message farther into the interior. For its teaching music on the piano, the school sourced a square piano, which survives in the Old Salem collection to this day. The instrument, by British maker John Kearsing, was made between 1810 and 1815, and provenance suggests that it was purchased for the Academy, potentially while Sarah was a student there. So if so, there's a good chance that 15-year-old Sarah Childress undertook studies on this very piano. But what music did she play? What were her preferences? Fortunately, a collection of Sarah's songs dating from her time at the Academy remains at the Polk House collection, and we're able to see exactly what sounds Sarah was bringing to life in the years before her marriage to James K. Polk. The book hosts a table of contents in alphabetical order, listing 24 songs inside. They range in subject matter to include romantic songs, patriotic marches, and Scottish folk tunes, popular themes seen nearly universally across parlor music from this time. It was common for wealthy piano-playing girls to compile their favorite songs, having single pages of printed works bound together in a book called a binder's volume, which essentially created a curated playlist for a young musician. Examining an individual's binder's volume reveals a fresh understanding of soundscapes in the American home and expresses the agency of the young woman who often made these selections. While she may not have been able to deviate much from the expectations of her life, a young woman could collaborate with her piano to create something with her own hands, for a moment having complete control. And it is important to remember that the piano created soundscapes experienced not only by Sarah and her kin, but also by the enslaved men and women who were forced to labor within those spaces. Yet Sarah's collection is music book, not volume, with printed pieces attached together. They are not songs they are written by Moravians or any instructors in the Academy, nor were they written by Sarah. They're each parlor songs by British and American composers with printed copies of these exact works distributed by music firms in cities like Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Boston. Yet, despite their printed availability, they were written out by hand. Who took the time to write out these songs and why? I'm indebted to Candace for being able to examine this book for me from afar, and we've determined that it likely wasn't Sarah herself who did this work, despite her ownership of the collection. Comparing Sarah's signature on the front of the book to another name found within, M. Writes, we can tell that this person was doing much of the transcribing, with perhaps another unknown person doing the rest. The identity of M. Writes remains somewhat unknown, but thanks to Johanna Brown, we may actually have an answer. Brother Matthias Roys, which is also spelled Wrights in many documents, was born in Salem in 1789 and worked as a glove maker, dyer, and tavern keeper. However, in the minutes for the 1815 Salem Elders Conference, Roys asked to be relieved from the supervision of the music and care of musical instruments, indicating his direct involvement with the musical education at Salem. Yet even if Roys, had stepped away from the Academy's music program in 1815, he may have come back by 1818, perhaps assisting in the transcription of sheet music for visiting students. Despite a market flush with printed sheet music, a tradition to copy these pieces, recycling them in a way, persisted. The act of creating manuscript music books was a practice that went back to New England singing schools in the early 18th century, worked by both men and women. In the 19th century, some seminaries encouraged the practice of manuscript writing, improving musical literacy and producing a literal hand-spun connection to their personal selections of music. With the Moravians' proclivity for music and composition and surviving rastrums, also known as staff pens, at a place like Salem, it's unsurprising that copying was happening on site. Perhaps Sarah selected these songs to be copied from the robust collections of music at the Academy or from music of friends and classmates, and her instructors helped write them out so that she can continue playing them at home on her family's Astor and Horwood, waiting for her back in Middle Tennessee. While Sarah's music book certainly includes many of those typical early 19th century romantic songs, and we can't, of course, precisely know how many were her explicit selections versus suggestions of an instructor, it does include some works that I think are particularly telling of Sarah's personality and future aspirations. She has 4 generals' marches, one of them being a General Jackson march, speaking to the budding of her close relationship with the 7th president. It also has a President's March, which dates to 1798, and 2 different versions of Hail to the Chief, one for the chorus and one for the march. The executive office was apparently on her mind. The latter song has survived with a somewhat legendary connection to Sarah and her assertion to use Hail to the Chief for presidential arrivals. Based on an 1810 poem called Lady of the Lake by Scottish poet Sir Walter Scott, the poem was wildly popular, and the text provided inspiration for comedic opera and theater. Around 1812, an English theater musician named James Sanderson set parts of Scott's poem to music, including the selection that we know as Hail to the Chief. Copies of Sanderson's work were rapidly disseminated in both Britain and the United States, and the song began to have an association with the American presidency in 1815, when it was played to celebrate the late President Washington and the end of the War of 1812. However, Sarah has been the one pinned as the person who solidified that connection, having it played each and every time her husband entered a room, immortalizing the musical pomp around the presidency. But perhaps it all actually comes back to Salem and her music. Now, after all of this talk about music, we are going to end with a musical treat for you. We have Juilliard-trained pianist Zach Hughes playing the introduction to Hail to the Chief on one of the Sigal Music Museum's many American square pianos, an 1834 Nuns and Clark instrument. The sound is much different than a modern piano, so listen closely, but it would not be too far off from what Sarah would have created on her Astor and Horwood as she herself sat down to play this song. So the Salem Academy not only provided Sarah Childress Polk with a highly competent education that allowed her to dazzle Washington and Nashville decades later in all manners of company, but also introduced her to the power and gravitas of carefully curated soundscapes in the song that she helped to ultimately become synonymous with the American presidency. Though Sarah may not have been a practiced musician for the rest of her life, the music education that she received as a young lady and access to her family's Astor and Horwood piano had a widely recognizable effect on her legacy. And as Sarah's piano brought joy to the families of her nieces, Middle Tennessee continued to transform, piano and industry flourishing throughout, giving more people the chance to harness the power of their own soundscapes. Thank you.
All right. Let me see if I can get my video back up here. Thank you so much, Ali and Tom. That was great and really exciting to be able to hear Hail to the Chief on a square piano, contemporary in our collection. That's really unique and exciting. So thank you all so much for sharing your time with us. At this point, the Q&A is open if you all have any questions for our presenters. But I'll just get started by letting you all maybe share a little bit about your museum, since the Sigal Music Museum is new, and we might have some people who haven't heard about what you all are doing over there or had a chance to visit. So if you all could maybe give a little introduction about your collection and some of what you all have been able to accomplish the last few years.
Sure. Well, Tom here is the founder, so he's really the best person to speak to that. But Tom founded the museum based on a smaller collection. A smaller collection of keyboards that he collected in his home. And then in 2019, we received a massive collection from a man in Boston named Marlowe Sigal, who had passed away. He was one of the late great collectors of American instruments, instruments in the United States. And the family selected us to take the instruments. And so they all came down here and sort of redefined our collection. So today we have an exhibit open that celebrates the gift of the collection, focusing on the keyboard instruments and the wind instruments, which comprise the bulk of it. Altogether, there was about over 1,000 objects that came to us. So it truly, redefined our experience and the capabilities of what we could share.
So right now the exhibit that you would see is called Sensational Sigal. And it's the highlights of the Sigal collection. There were many, many instruments that we could not show, but they will provide the basis for further stories as we go on. This show will run through at least the end of the year and probably a little bit into 2022. We're looking forward to our next exhibit, which is going to be Sounds of America, and we'll have a very, very strong American-centric focus on not only keyboards, but all sorts of musical instruments from 1720 to 1920.
We'll find a way to put Hail to the Chief in there somehow, I'm certain.
It'll have to be there. But if you get a chance, once you're traveling again, consider coming to Greenville, a beautiful city with lots of things to do, and then you can see the collection yourself.
That's great. Yeah, and I appreciate you all making these connections between the piano we have here that belonged to Sarah Childress and her family and the collection that you all have there. And I think it's really going to become, if not already, a really encyclopedic reference for people who are interested in early American music. And I can't wait to be able to see it myself. Well, Ali, I really appreciate the research you were able to do into Sarah's manuscript music book. So this had been sort of a question that I had had for a while, for the past few years working with our collection here at the Polk Museum. So this had always been understood to be written in Sarah's hand, and this presentation gave me kind of a chance to look at that a little closer, and we sort of realized that it, did not appear to be her handwriting, and then you were able to make this connection to this instructor working in music education at Salem. I really like this idea of this being Sarah's playlist in a way, or like a kind of peek into her own musical selections or her experience with music. Since you've had a chance now to kind of look at this digitally, at least, what kind of insights do you think we can take away from Sarah's playlist here?
I mean, I think a lot of it, from just a practical museum standpoint, it can give you a lot of an interpretive hook. There's a lot you can do just making recordings of some of those pieces, because like I said, they're all printed. You don't have to go from the manuscript. You can just get a printed version from 1820, and there you go. And you can make recordings of these. You can work with local musicians to kind of bring that an instrument back to life, or even do it recorded on a contemporary instrument. But I think a lot of people haven't heard those songs, and the sheet music is out there. So it's an easy and in a really effective way, I think, of bringing that era to life and bringing Sarah to life. And I think, especially knowing where Sarah goes in life, it was absolutely fascinating to me to see these really particular selections that were just really political in nature. So I think a lot of binders, volumes, and manuscript music books, anything that's like created by a young woman like this, they are very multidimensional. I mean, it shows a different side to people that like maybe they're not comfortable expressing in conversation, but they can play these songs. So yeah.
So I have a question
Oh, yeah.
for you. Are they largely marches, as we heard, or
No,
are they ballads?
It's a big mix of everything.
Okay.
So she had
Are there comic songs in the bunch?
No.
Okay, because that particularly in the South, that would have been very, very common to have a binder's volume that has some comic songs in along with it, so everybody has a good laugh. And then the kind of sappy ballads, and then some gallops and some marches. You
had to have it all, but
it's an awesome playlist.
It really is. I mean, it's this really unique peek into a young woman's life, and for so many young women, that's all you get. You get their binder's volume, maybe, and that's it. And that's for a wealthy white young woman. So it's a really important survival. Any binder's volume or any manuscript music book that a museum collection has, I mean, I think the value in it is so colorful.
Yeah, that's great. And here at the museum, we talk about Sarah as being this sort of partner to her husband in terms of her ambition, her education, her like drive to move him into increasingly powerful places in American politics. And
she truly sets it up. She creates the soundscape.
Yeah, it is so interesting.
What an incredible role.
Yeah, seeing that she's choosing things that like the comedy is lacking, and then instead we've got like leaning kind of heavily on these politically themed selections of music, which seems to just fit perfectly with what we know about her involvement in her husband's career. But it's interesting that this predates her marriage and her involvement in politics really in that kind of direct way. And so just sort of the consistency in her personality and her interests there is really interesting, developing at such a young age while she's a student at Salem. But, it is such a treasure to have in our collection, be able to get that glimpse into her as a person. One of the things I was interested in, Tom, in your presentations was this reference to the Panic of 1837 and the impact that sort of would have on piano making and piano buying. I was curious if you could share a little bit more about sort of the economic side of things there, and what roles pianos played in people's lives as their finances changed or as the economy changed, sort of in this sort of peak period of Polk's political career.
Okay, well, the panic essentially resulted from some ill-advised policies that Andrew Jackson was pursuing. He was, very strongly against the National Bank that had been set up. And then the Species Act essentially prevented people from using anything but actual money to buy actual property. and there wasn't, quite honestly, enough species to go around to allow people to do things in the West. And so there was a run on the banks in 1837. It began to revive in 1838. It looked like it was going to turn around, and then in 1839 took another dip, and this time it went very, very dark. And so we moved from recession to full depression, and that would move continue through 1843. If you've heard of the term hard times tokens, these were species that were minted kind of in a ironic and sarcastic way to say, see, we'll make our own money. And they would feature, things like sinking ships on the front of the coin, and very dire, warnings on the back. So it was a hard time, and particularly for the people who were making things that you didn't absolutely have to have, like pianos. It became very difficult to make a living.
And a lot of them, their businesses
the businesses shuttered. So not only in New York, but in Philadelphia and Boston, we see a number of the businesses shuttering, and things that might have happened in the West, didn't quite happen yet.
Yeah, I liked thinking about this other topic that you kind of brought up about just the physicality, the material side of having access to a piano in the West when you're lacking access to like a seaport or really great roads, especially, moving into a place like Murfreesboro or Columbia in this early part of the 19th century. Did that present a barrier to piano ownership in this early period? Or do you sort of expect to see a piano in wealthier homes, even in Western areas pretty early on?
So wealthy families tended to find a way to have a piano as a status symbol.
Joel found a way.
The difficulty, of course, was that the piano might arrive in various states of disrepair, and do you have anyone who's coming through that can either tune or repair an instrument? So one of the notices that we didn't bring forward this time, but would appear very frequently in the papers in Lexington and Nashville, would be for a tuner is coming into town. He'll be there for the next week or two. He'll list his times and where to go find him, because you want to catch him while he's there and get your piano worked on.
Yeah, a lot of these itinerant musicians and teachers would offer that. So any minor repairs or tuning.
The piano that we use for recording Hail to the Chief had come to rural South Carolina when it was new in 1834. And it's a unichord, meaning that it has one string for every note. Very unusual for a piano, but what it means is that any one unison will always sound good unto itself because there's only the one string. And so such a piano goes out of tune effectively, less rapidly, and would get more use time between tunings. So very popular in the South and also popular in the West, and they advertised it as such at the time.
That's really interesting that even as the majority of these pianos are imported in this period, that you still have a market for local makers, in that sense that you need someone to be able to repair and to tune, and you still need someone on hand locally in the West to be able to really have these things be usable in a household. Well, before we wrap up, I guess, do you all have anything you'd like to leave us with in terms of music in the West, or any final words?
Well, this is really the tip of the iceberg, and we've sort of talked about exploring this for a while. And like Tom was saying, with our next exhibition focusing on music and American music industry, I think it gives us a really good jumping off point for that. So I'm just, for one, excited to keep going and seeing what is out there. So we really appreciate this opportunity to be able to delve into this.
Well, thank you all so much for joining us. I've learned a lot from you all already, and definitely look forward to continued research and work as well. Thank you all so much. Thank you to the Sigal Music Museum. As I mentioned at the top, Polk's America has typically been an evening program for us. So if you enjoyed this lunchtime edition, please let us know, and we can try to do more of these if this is a time that allows more people to be able to join in on this type of presentation. If you haven't listened to the podcast yet, you are really missing out. This especially is going to be a great episode. You'll have a chance to hear some of the music that Ali and Tom shared with us today. But it's much more than just re-listening to the lectures. It's got original music, site visits, additional guest experts, and behind the scenes content, all in 30-minute episodes. So not a huge time commitment, but do give it a listen anywhere you look for podcasts. It's on Spotify. It's where I usually listen, but we'll have new episodes coming out soon. Our next Polk America is in 2 weeks on May 25th at 7 p.m. Central, and we will be welcoming Scott Harris of the James Monroe Museum in Fredericksburg, Virginia. This will be another live virtual presentation with free tickets available starting this afternoon. Make sure you're following Polk America and the President James K. Polk Home and Museum on Facebook and Instagram so that you can catch the full lineup this year, and follow the Sigal Music Museum on Instagram and Facebook as well to follow along with exhibitions and programming that they will have going on. Thank you once again to Alexandra and Thomas, and thank you all for joining us. Have a good rest of your day.
Bye.